Well, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Danya, for joining us. This is the inaugural seminar that we're having at A&A CPA. The first speaker for our seminar series is Danya Shakfeh, and she is a business law attorney. She's somebody that we've worked with quite a bit recently, especially in the area of new clients where they are buying a business or starting a business. She's got a real specialty in that area. Um, and we've enjoyed working with her because she's very creative. She owns her own business, Motiva Business Law, and she's going to bring us a lot of, I think, very interesting perspectives because even if you're working for a company, you could start a company. And we have several of our clients right now that have their own, they're a W-2 employee, but they've started another business. So, Danya, take it away.
Thanks, Judy, and everyone at any sorry A&A accountants, and I'm so honored to be the first one who is doing these presentations for you. So as Judy had mentioned, I'm a business law attorney, and I'm based out. I'm based out in Oak Brook, and I'm going to be talking to you today about how to buy a business the right way. All right, let's get started. So I just would like to take a quick poll. If you just want to put it in the chat, if you have purchased a business recently, or if you're thinking about buying a business, I'd like to know kind of where everyone is, so I can tailor how I address this topic, based off of where everyone is in this process. So feel free to leave a comment in the chat. And also, if you have any questions, concerns, or fears, of course, you can put those in and I can talk to those questions at the end of the presentation. So we'll get started then. All right, so again, about me, I've been practicing corporate law for over 13 years, and I help protect business owners' dreams and futures so they can focus on profits. So I'm going to get started first about just the steps of how to buy a business. I have a lot of clients who come into my office. Actually, it's a very common scenario. People come into my office like on a Monday and they say, we want to close on Thursday. And I'm like, wow, so that's really fast. And I'm going to talk about why that's really fast, especially really late on like when you want to actually hire a lawyer and bring a lawyer involved. So the first step, um, usually like the buyer and seller will just have like informal discussions about the process, or excuse me, about if they want to buy a business. The seller will often provide some uh, preliminary financial documents like tax returns, perhaps some profit and loss statements. It's also a good time for the parties to, build up trust. And it goes both ways. And then if they feel comfortable moving forward, they often sign something called a letter of intent, or LOI. And that's where they will put in writing, like the deal breakers and the purchase price and the type of sale. The LOI is mostly non-binding. And I'm going to talk more about sort of intent, in the next slide. And then the next process is something called due diligence. And I see a lot of people skimp out on this process. A lot of the times the buyer will say, I know the seller, I trust the seller. So I don't really need to, like, I kind of know how this is going to go. But it's really important that a buyer does their due diligence and treat the transaction at an arm's length. Like, treat the seller like they're a stranger, even if they're like, like you're sister or brother. It's just really important. You just want to do the basics of that. And so, like the buyer will ask for more documents, contracts and marketing, documents, liabilities, more financial documents, if there's a lease involved, the customer's list, and all of that. And then the next step is the asset or stock purchase agreement, which is the final, or excuse me, like it's the final purchase agreement. And then of course you have closing. So if you've ever purchased a house, then you probably know how a closing goes, and it's kind of similar to that. And the turnaround time, like I said, you don't want to call your lawyer on a Monday and say I want to close on a Thursday. Usually, this will take, I mean, 2 to 6+ months, and it depends on how big the transaction is, how complicated the transaction is. But even like a basic, simple, sale can take 2 months at least, because you always have a bare minimum that you want to do. So to talk a little bit more about like getting, I want to move here. Um, so, again, like the buyer and seller, part of that process when they want to get to know each other is one, to see if this is going to be a viable business deal, not just financially, but, sellers want to make sure that the buyer's not going to waste their time. And also, like a lot of sellers too, because they built, this baby of theirs, their business, and there's employees. And so I commonly hear the sellers say something like, I want to make sure that the current employees that, who are under my charge are going to be taken care of after I sell the business. And so those are the things that people are looking for, like when they wanted to see if they want to buy or sell the business. And the next step, of course, in this process is show me the money. Hey, hey seller, like, is this a profitable business or am I just buying a job? And same on the seller side, hey buyer, do you have money to buy this business, or are you in the process of getting a loan? And so, and of course, they want to talk about like the financials of it. And typically, like the buyers and seller, uh, they'll sign a non-disclosure agreement, also known as an NDA. One common thing to be careful about if you're on the buyer side is you don't want to sign an NDA that puts too much responsibility on the buyer. So, like, just because you are getting some tax returns, it doesn't mean that you want to sign something saying that you're going to be responsible for the next 5 years if these tax returns get out. And so like that's a common thing that people overlook, especially on the buy side, but usually the attorneys are not involved yet, like in my experience. Um, Now, as far as the letter of intent, what do you want to put in the letter of intent? Now, I just want to say here that this is really the time to hire a lawyer, especially if you're on the buy side. Sometimes people write their own letter of intent and then they come to the lawyer, and that puts the lawyer in or like in a hard position because sometimes the LOIs have a timeline. And so, for example, if the LOI says, we're going to close after 20 days after signing the LOI, and the attorney is going to be like, wait a minute, 20 days is way too fast. It's not enough time. It can, again, like compromise the quality of legal services that you may receive. Also, like another problem if you don't talk to a lawyer at this phase is that the parties may try to negotiate terms on their own, and then the attorney might come and say, wait a minute, like you should have said, ABC, and try to come back and change those terms after you've agreed to them can cause a lot of bad will. And so that can hurt your deal. And so the common terms that the parties or the attorneys will put like in the letter of intent is, or excuse me, like a deal breaker. So this is really important, like where you want to be honest with yourself and with your lawyer and the other side about what's going to kill this deal that I know about upfront. So for example, if a seller, he wants to sell his restaurant, but he knows he really wants to keep this, excuse me, like certain equipment, and the buyer knows that he really wants the equipment. Well, if we know up front that's going to be a deal breaker, then why bother wasting everyone's time? And you certainly like don't want to bring that up at the 11th hour and hurt any goodwill that you may have. And then secondly, the purchase price and the financing. So you can change the purchase price later on, but the parties like to agree to at least, like the number that they think that they're going to buy the business on. And then that's usually based off of the numbers that have been previously provided. Now, of course, the type of sale, is it going to be an asset sale or a stock sale? And I'm going to talk more about that. But basically, So like, is the buyer buying the stuff of the business, the equipment, the trademark, the customer list, or are they actually buying the company, it's the stock of the company? And then also like the due diligence timeline and a closing date. You don't always have a closing date, but like generally or like the LOI will have like 60 to 90 days. And it's also very common to have something called a no shop clause, meaning that the buyer often requests the seller to not go and sell the business while the buyer is doing their due diligence. You certainly, as a buyer, like you don't want to be thinking, okay, like I'm having these talks to buy this business, I'm so excited, and then all of a sudden the seller was like, oh, well, I sold it. That's really going to upset a buyer, especially if they spent money on attorney's fees. And of course, any contingencies or transition, do you want the seller as the buyer? Do you want the seller to stay in the business and help you transition everything and all of that? So that's that. Now, I do want to talk about asset sale versus stock sale, not to get too complicated, but again, is the buyer buying the equipment or the things that make up the business, or are they buying the actual business? And sometimes it's equally a tax decision as it is, or excuse me, like a legal decision. So it's always something that you want to run by your accountants. But usually with like smaller deals, and usually buyers prefer buying assets because the buyer does not want to buy the whole history of the company unless there's a good reason to. Because if the history of the company is subject to lawsuits, for example, like, a buyer does not want to take on all that liability. But sometimes it is a good idea to purchase the actual company if the company is dependent on referrals or there are contracts that are the source of the business. And so again, it's part like a strategy, part tax, and part legal decision. Um, One common mistake, however, I'm going to talk a little bit, excuse me, I'm going to talk about this more, is that a lot of buyers think that if they're only buying the assets, then they're not going to have any of the liability of the seller. And the only exception, and if you had to guess, what exception that would be is going to be taxes. Because the government is always going to find its way to get its money, right? And so the taxes often attached to the assets if the seller is not up to date on their taxes. So when the buyer buys or like those assets, that liability is going to transfer to the buyer, and the seller is going to say sayonara and go like retire in some other country, and the buyer is going to be stuck with this liability. So you want to avoid that. I'm going to talk about how to make sure that you don't have that problem. But keep in mind that just because you're not buying the actual company, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be off the hook for taxes. Next. Okay, so what kind of things do buyers look for in due diligence? So, so as a buyer, it's going to depend if you are buying the assets or the actual company, and the kind of questions that or excuse me, like the kind of documents you're going to ask for when someone's buying a business. But basically, my checklist includes things like employee records. I just created these random shapes just to keep your engagement, but the actual shapes have no value. It's just for fun. But basically liens, taxes, specifically employment taxes and sales taxes is really what's at issue. Contracts, are there any vendor contracts? And to what extent do those vendor contracts play in keeping the business running? Do these contracts, excuse me. So basically, if the contracts were to fall apart, how would that impact the value of the business? And also you want more like financial documents, point of sale logs, bank statements, budget variance documents. This is the part also where I, or like bringing the accountants like Judy and Bill and Lorna. And I've done this before where I loop them in. And of course, I'm at this point, if your lawyer is not telling you to bring in an accountant or some sort of financial advisor, then you should get a new lawyer. But always have an accountant to take a look at those financial documents. In some cases, you want to know if the seller has potential lawsuits, especially if you're buying the company itself and it's a stock sale. Also, you want to check whose authority is required to actually sell the business. I can't tell you how many times I have a seller who says, "Oh, I'm the only owner of the business." And then we check the corporate documents and no, they have their sister on there, or or some person we had no idea existed. And they're like, "Oh yeah, so and so is on the documents, but they're not really involved." And I'm like, "Well, you know what? As a buyer, if that person is not consenting to the sale of the business, I mean, it could come back and haunt you. So you really want to make sure and do not take a seller's word on it. Of course, intellectual property, are the trademarks still registered and up to date? And those are, I mean, that's like the overall. Of course, any licenses, franchises, agreements that would all follow, like under that umbrella. And as the attorney, I look at those documents and make sure that everything is up to date. And then at that point, we, perhaps may reassess if the buyer actually wants to buy the business or they find out some huge problem in the finances, or there's something wrong with the sale, or what. So like this is the part where things often fall apart, but it's really essential to do this process before buying a business. All right. So once we take all the stuff that we learn in due diligence, we want to use that information to create the purchase agreement, that final binding contract that everyone's going to take to their grave, basically, like any contract, right? So, for example, warranties. I'm, as the lawyer, as I draft that document, I'm going to use the information that I received in due diligence to create the warranties. So to have a simple example, if I am buying, a restaurant, I would like the seller to warranty the equipment, and to promise to me that the equipment has been maintained over the certain amount of years and that it has no defaults, for example, or like defects, I'm sorry. Same with contingencies. So let's just say, a seller is acquiring or may acquire a huge account, but the buyer is going to say, for example, I don't want to buy the business until you acquire this account. So you can put that as a contingency. Same with liabilities, financing, of course, especially if you are a buyer that is going to get financing, you want to have a financing contingency. It's the same as a mortgage contingency if you've purchased, property. Holdback clauses are really good ways for buyers to protect themselves. If you see a lot of red flags as a buyer in the due diligence phase, you can ask the seller. This actually is not done too commonly. I feel like it should be done more commonly, that a buyer asks the seller, I want to hold a certain amount of the purchase price in an escrow account if, or like in case a certain event happens, and that can protect, the buyer and actually keep the power, or like in the buyer's hands if something were to go wrong, say 6 months, out, and then that money can be transferred after, for example, 6 months to the seller. And then, of course, the purchase price, that could be renegotiated after perhaps like finding that the financials are not what was originally presented or that there's all these liabilities. So again, it's so important to properly do all your due diligence. Next, so the purchase agreements exhibits. Obviously, I'm not going to go too much in depth, but so you have an idea of what these things look like. Basically, you're going to see something called a bill of sale, which actually will ensure that a buyer is actually buying the equipment, the assignment and assumption agreements that helps the contracts transfer to the buyer if there are any contracts involved. A transitional agreement, that's something you really want to make sure you have in writing if you want a seller to stay and help out and to actually like designate a certain, like number of hours per week, for example. That would be included. One overlooked thing is the franchisor consents. A lot of people buy a business and they think they're just buying a license. And because there are a lot of people who actually are franchises, but they didn't do the work they're supposed to be to call themselves franchises. But it could still be a problem. So basically, if there's a third party consent where, so for example, if someone's buying a Dunkin' Donuts, I mean, like that's a more obvious example, or like Dunkin' Donuts is going to want to make sure that this buyer is going to meet their requirements to be a franchisee. So you want to be careful about that as well as the buyer and is the franchisor, consenting. And same with the landlord, if there's a lease, involved that the buyer actually has rights to occupy the property in question. Corporate consents, all the shareholders or the members need to consent to the sale, and a list of assets and the purchase price the purchase price breakdown. So like how much is inventory, how much is goodwill, and again, having your accountant provide feedback is also very important as well on that particular, because you don't want to overpay taxes. Bulk sales notice. I'm very, this is also a huge, overlooked piece, especially for buyers who try to buy, business without having, counsel or professionals helping them. And so previously, I talked about how a buyer could, end up with the liability of the sales or employment taxes. And so what happens, or like what the parties are supposed to do, it's really the buyer's responsibility. I mean, it's both parties' responsibility, but the hot potato is going to be with the buyer if the buyer does not get this done. So basically, like you file or like you send a document to the Illinois Department of Revenue, and like they say, it has to be done at least 10 days before closing. And so again, if you come on if you come on a Monday and say I want to close on a Thursday, like you're not going to meet that 10-day timeline. And then like the buyer will say to like the Department of Revenue, hey, like we are transferring assets. And then the Department of Revenue is going to do their research and make sure that the taxes are paid. And if the seller has paid their taxes and there are no outstanding taxes, then the buyer is going to get a release. But if not, then the Department of Revenue is going to say something like, we want the parties to hold a certain amount of the purchase price and an escrow account. So, and that's really important for the buyer again, because you don't want the seller to leave to a different country and the buyer is left with the hot potato. And financing, I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. There are so many ways to finance the purchase of a business. Of course, you can go to an SBA loan. And like those are easier to get, but because they're so easy to get, they tend to have a higher interest, like versus like like a standard commercial loan. You can also do a seller financing where, basically the buyer can pay the seller over time. You can do an earn-out agreement where basically there's like kind of a price and, excuse me, and then the seller will agree to like receiving certain payments based off of the performance of the business. It's kind of risky and it's not my favorite way to do it, but it's certainly an option, because what can happen is that the buyer and seller perhaps may not agree on why the business did not perform well. Of course, the buyer is going to say, well, because the business is not performing well. And then the seller might say, well, it's not performing well under your watch, buyer. So, but it's still an option. Of course, you can get investors or you can get like family and friends to help, fund. And then of course the closing, this is just a breakdown of all the documents that are, like attached to the purchase agreement. So basically, again, it's going to be the actual purchase agreement, the bill of sale, and all the licenses that may be involved, and at least transition deployments agreements. If you're transferring employments, you want to get that taken care of. If if you're going to have an escrow and hold back funds, that's also plays a part as well. And then of course the money. And so that's the part like where the buyer pays the seller. And that is the end of my presentation. And I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. So you can pop it in the chat or I'll let the accountants ask on my behalf.
You can also unmute yourself now. So go ahead.
Hi, this is News. Hi, thank you for your presentation. Very helpful.
You're welcome.
Just a quick note. as part of due diligence, I think audited financial statement would also be helpful. Audited financials will be very helpful to show the
Yes,
actual worth of the company. Okay,
of course.
as part of the due diligence. Just
Mhm.
okay.
Yes, thank you. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's also helpful to if there is a bank and lender involved, they often do their own due diligence as well. And so it's nice to get their, opinion. So obviously when there's money at risk and that money is not the buyer, then they're gonna want to do their own due diligence, and it's helpful to get that. So yeah, thank you.
Another interesting news I heard yesterday or day before, Subway chain is being purchased by a private equity firm for $20 billion. And it took them a year and a half for the deal to go through. So how complicated that was. Just a thought, just a comment.
I
$20
feel like
billion. Yeah.
I feel like for that purchase price, a year and a half is impressive.
$20 billion for the chain, Subway chain.
Yeah, yeah. I do see a question here. Is having a data room like mandatory to access the company documents? That's a good question. So like a data room is basically where the parties can upload the documents. It's not required, it's more of just a way that people share documents. I use a Dropbox, which we call a data room. That's basically what that is. So did that answer your question, Melissa? You're
Yeah.
welcome.
So I'm going to ask a question. You
Sure.
said something about restaurants when you were talking about your due diligence.
Mhm.
And what struck me, there's a couple of things that struck me. One was if it's a restaurant, they're going to have their equipment, which you want a warranty on, that it's workable.
Right.
But if you bought an inventory for something like that, is there any kind of warranty as far as the quality of the inventory? Because what if you bought spices that were bad? You know what I mean?
Or obsolete, maybe obsolete inventory.
Yeah, yeah.
Or obsolete. Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, it's what the parties agree to. I will say this, that if you have good due diligence, then the details of those start to matter less. So, for example, if a buyer requests the purchase receipts of that, of the inventory, and the seller can prove that certain inventory was purchased last week, well, the buyer isn't going to sit here and try to, or I mean, at least the attorney, I'm not going to sit there and be like, well, I want you to warranty up and down and possibly kill the deal when we know that the spices were purchased a week ago. And so it just becomes something that we're, arguing over nothing. That's a good question. So again, it just really speaks to why it's so important to properly do due diligence, and how it just helps everything else be more smooth and decrease the risk of the buyer.
Absolutely.
Are there any more questions?
Excellent. You mentioned when typically you get involved, what's the ideal point you should be involved?
The earlier the better. But I would say before signing the LOI. Once the LOI is signed, it already compromises my ability to help my clients. Especially like one time I had an LOI where like the closing was in 10 days, and I was like, oh my goodness, like that was really hard for me. I think the deal died. And that was part of the reason. But I apologize if there's any background noise. I have my kids, they're being very loud. I'm not sure if you can hear them, but yeah, so I would say prior to signing the LOI, and even better when you're negotiating the LOI. So, and even if I'm not communicating with the other side, I'm often in the background advising the client so that they're making the best use of those negotiations. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions that anyone has for Danya?
Danya, can you tell us a couple of deals that didn't go through and why they didn't? What is the kind of thing that would make a deal kind of stumble and not go through?
Sure, that's a great question. So And I think you're gonna love this answer as the accountant but poor financial documents on the part of the seller. So for example, we not too long ago, I had my client was the buyer and they wanted to buy a car wash. And the seller had like no profit and loss statements. So we asked to see all of the expenses and the profits of the business, of course. And all the seller could provide was just in an email. He just literally wrote payroll X amount, utilities X amount, rent X amount. And it was just like 5 lines of expenses. But one thing that was notably missing was water. And again, this was a car wash. So so I went back and I was like, well, where's water on this? And because it's got to be eating a certain, like chunk of the bills. And at that point, the buyer, my client, got very apprehensive because once we dug more into the numbers, we realized that it was not a profitable business at all. I mean, the seller said that he was making X amount of money, but when we actually looked at the numbers, maybe he was making a profit of like literally $1,000 a month, but not having clear numbers is one. Another one that I see where we had a deal where the LOI, it was that case that I just told you about, where it was like a 10-day turnaround. And I would say a huge reason why that deal didn't go through was just all the goodwill was killed. Part of it, unfortunately, there was a business broker involved who was very aggressive and not very pleasant to deal with. And he was obviously representing the seller and trying to sell the business. And he was just very difficult to deal with. And it just became a point where my client, the buyer, just didn't even want to deal with the seller anymore, just on that account alone. And so I would say again, and then so in summary, I would say either really bad numbers or really bad emotional management of the deal.
Well, and to follow up on
Yeah.
Judy's question, I would think it would be very difficult in the car wash example, not true maybe today, but in the past when you only put your quarters in,
Yeah.
doing due diligence on a cash business like that, that's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so this guy, because he had such poor financials, he actually asked my client if he could have 2 more months where he could start documenting all of the all of right. At first my buyer was like, sure. And I was like, no, that's a terrible idea. Like now he has an opportunity, to cook the books and, especially when you're dealing with a business that's cash there. I don't know if anyone's seen Breaking Bad. If you want to put in the comments if you've seen Breaking Bad, you do want to do your due diligence when you buy a car wash or like any business that has a lot of cash transactions because it really could be like a money laundering scheme. I'm not saying all cash businesses are like that, but that's where they often go, and so that's one thing I want to protect my clients from too. So
Yeah.
yes. And good bookkeeping is really important there too.
And on the other side, when you're selling, you need to think about making sure that you keep track of all your personal business expenses and make them clear so that financial statements can understand that, because we also worked with you on one that didn't go through because there were a lot of expenses on the books for tax savings
Right.
that were really not ongoing expenses of the business if the buyer had bought it. And the problem with that is the buyer, I think, understood that. We understood that, but the bank that was financing it didn't understand that. So the financials were in such a way that there was no way they could borrow the money for a value that was really there. So if you're selling a company, just look on that side of you need to be prepared up front before you even put it on the market to explain the differences between what you think the value is and what the value shows based on the tax return.
Yeah, that's a great point. What we see often on the seller side is that sellers are not prepared to sell. And what I like to tell my sellers is look at this checklist that you're gonna or you should be getting from a buyer, like the due diligence checklist and pretend and gather those documents as if you're going to have to turn them over tomorrow. And if you don't have them, then start preparing them. And really, a seller should be looking at, like a 2 to 3 year process preparing with the sale of their business, and not just legal and financial, but also marketing and processes and procedures, and and preparing the employees. So, I mean, that's a great point. Just, like a seller should take that into account if they actually want to successfully sell the business, and have banks be comfortable with, providing, like the financing and lending.
We actually had a couple cases where we were asked to do evaluation of the practice or the business, just to determine what the value was and what are the things that change the value, so that the seller knows that if they hire all their relatives, that's going to change the value when they try to sell it. Most people don't understand how a value is determined by a bank. And if you're going to sell it and someone's going to have to finance it, and you're not just selling it to a cash buyer, even though you're not the one getting the financing, you have to understand it if you want to sell it. It's like if you sell a house. If you want to sell a house for $1 million, but it doesn't appraise out for $1 million, you're not going to sell the house for $1 million. So the
Yeah.
financing company is what really dictates everything.
Yeah, agree. Yeah. It comes down to the money, often. So,
Well,
um,
after you've gotten past your due diligence, because I think it bears repeating, and you said it in your presentation, the due diligence is really critical, because if you just, do a handshake on the street corner and buy something and you haven't done the due diligence, you're in trouble, because
yeah.
there's no way you can go back.
I can't tell you how many clients have come to my, or not, I'm sorry, potential clients, because I don't take those cases, where they're like, yeah, we bought the business and now they're getting all these like tax bills and they're being fined and all these things. And it was not even a big transaction, because a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm just buying the business for $20,000 or $30,000. And they end up having to spend more money than that on fixing the way that the transaction went. So they think, oh, I don't need to hire a lawyer. It's not worth it. It's just a small deal. But I don't think they realize just how much it costs to clean up the mess, versus just having, just investing the money up front and doing it the right way, even for a small insignificant deal. And no deal is too insignificant, in my opinion, especially if there's taxes and liabilities involved.
Exactly.
Danya,
Yes.
I got a comment or a question.
Sure.
Now that there's so much talk about artificial intelligence, AI, do you foresee the use of AI in assessing the value of a firm? Are buyers going to use AI for that?
That's a good question. I think that's actually a better question for the accountants, because I'm not too involved in the valuations.
Right.
So maybe like Bill or Lorna and Judy can answer that question.
Okay.
But if your question is whether AI is going to write up the legal documents,
Yeah.
maybe, but you still want a lawyer reviewing that, because they've done some, I think over time AI is because people feed it so much, because that's how it gets its data, and there's actually more junk being fed to it, and so the output is only going to be as good as the input, and the more people using it is just actually gonna, the quality is actually be pretty bad.
It's only
Okay.
going to ever be a tool.
Right.
And it's like you said, Danya, it's as good as the information that's gone into it.
Right.
I mean, I can't see it doing valuations for a long time, because there's not enough information in it.
Yeah, it's probably too early to tell. I'm not even sure how it could do that, but this number, so
I mean, it could,
yeah,
I'm sure it could lead you in the right direction and stuff,
yeah,
but I mean, even if you're valuing real estate, it's like whoever's the appraiser, they got to go out and find the stuff. So
right. And also too, like the questions that you ask, um, really matters, the quality that you're going to get from the AI, and the only person who's going to ask the right questions are the experts, right?
yeah.
Versus, a lay person or someone who has no expertise. They're going to ask the wrong questions, so they're going to get the wrong answers. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure if your question is whether we're going to be replaced, or, I mean, I think to some extent, like, like Bill said, it's just a tool like anything else, but that's it.
Okay.
if people don't have questions, I'd love to hear feedback as well on the presentation. If it was easy to understand, if the information was useful and something that you would use in the future, I would love also to hear any good and bad or good or constructive feedback. And this is my email and phone number. So I'd love to hear from the participants too, even after the presentation. You can also send me your questions after as well, and I can try to see what I can do to answer them.
It was wonderful, easy to
No.
understand, and I'm really appreciative. I don't have immediate plans to put it in action, but I would like to hear those. And I have a general question to the organizer, I guess. I see being it recorded, so are you planning to have like a library for the people who couldn't participate like in 2 weeks, and they can go back to it?
Our plan is to do like a YouTube channel, so there would be a recording on YouTube that you could go see this presentation. Danya's also going to have a copy of it. She may have excerpts from it, but ultimately our plan is to build a library so you can go see these things and watch them on your own time on YouTube.
Is this like the logical plan for people who trying to get into business, or it's just different issues depending on whoever is available to give this talk?
Well, it's kind of the plan we have right now. Is right now we're looking at buying a business. There's going to be other topics that we bring up. Some of them may apply more to you as we get into running a business, but there's going to be a variety of guest speakers that we bring in so that there's similar presentations like this. Obviously not on starting a business, but it's something that, you know, maybe it's going to be more towards, I don't know. What other topics do we have coming up, Judy? I don't remember off the top of my head.
Well, we have them in 4 categories, and see if I can remember them off the top of my head. One is going to be buying a business. One is basically running a business. One is soft things like employee management, and things that are more HR type. How do you impact your employees? How do you become a good leader? Things like that. And then the fourth one, I think, was that's a good idea. It's just good ideas that we run into that clients are doing. One of the examples that I'm going to put up there that at some point we're going to run is we are in the process of transitioning our email. And our email is going from one platform to another. And we're doing this principally because we, in our particular profession, are spending, I would say, 35% to 40% of our everyday dealing with email. It has become a time warp. And so we've found a new software, a new platform that we're going to try out. And assuming it works as advertised, then we're going to have someone come talk about it. And what it does basically is manages your email so that you're getting things on a subject bundled together. And for example, I had maybe 10 emails in the last 2 days that were just me being copied on something that took over my email for no reason. We're getting a software that will help manage that. So we're going to learn a lot from those things, and some of those vendors will come talk about what they've done, and then maybe we'll have a seminar just on how to manage change so that it doesn't disrupt you, because we decided to do this just before a tax deadline and just before I left the country, and this may not have been the best week. So those are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about.
Super.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, cousin. I guess my microphone is really working very well. But I am in the category of I already purchased the business, but I'd like to renegotiate. It's a franchise. I'd like to renegotiate my franchise fees. And I wonder if, Danya, if you have any thoughts on how to negotiate and leverage that.
I will say that generally speaking, trying to renegotiate so is it like the royalty fees or other, like which fees are you referring to in the franchise?
Exactly, the royalty and marketing fees that they assess. That's part of the revenue.
So yeah, I mean, generally once you sign those, they're really hard to renegotiate. They're actually hard to negotiate to begin with, and part of the reason is because the franchisors are required to have some level of uniformity to their franchise agreements because, I mean, part of the benefit of having, a franchise or being a franchisor is that the franchises look the same. And so if each franchisee, is trying to tailor the franchise to their own needs or views, then it stops being, or it stops having that benefit. But once you've entered into it, it's a lot harder even to renegotiate. I actually don't know of anyone who has successfully renegotiated after signing in. I guess the only time I can think of when it might be a viable option is if you are or like doing another franchise, if you want to open, like another franchise of the same store or like the same brand. But I honestly, unfortunately, have not seen that play out. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but
Yeah,
it's really tough to renegotiate those.
for sure. No, I think when I went into it, I was like, is there a break at a certain level? And so I opened the door when I first brought it. So, but there's potential for it to happen. I think that franchisor is would be more amenable to adjusting that. So
Yeah. I mean, if maybe there's something you can bring to the table instead of saying, I just want lower fees, or, like just offering something in return. Cause I don't know, I mean, I don't know enough about like your specific situation. So, but I'm just speaking more generally.
for sure,
So there's one way. And then of course, if it's a newer franchise, they are way more, like open to those negotiations in general just because they don't have that leverage. But it's like any contract trying to it's like what's their incentive to change the terms when everyone's already signed everything. So but I guess it doesn't hurt to ask, but
for sure. All
maybe
right, thank you. Yeah.
you're welcome.
I'm also going to put your email and phone number in the chat, Danya, just so that people have it. That might
Awesome.
be easier than just, you can also obviously take a picture if you have
Yeah,
your
I
phone.
just did that. I just did that. Took a picture.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good way to capture it. So you will have it, if I typed it in here correct, you'll have it in the chat and your picture, which that way you can capture those.
Awesome. And then too, if anyone wants to sign up to my newsletter, if you want to drop your email into the chat and I'll have my staff add you. I have like my monthly newsletter. I send, free business and legal tips. And I also do a lot of my own seminars too. And so I send out those notices there too. And I'm also going to, if anyone wants to schedule a consultation, this is the link. I threw it in the chat as well. So
Perfect.
so I appreciate being a guest here, especially for the inaugural one. I feel so special, and I really value our relationship, with A&A accounting. And so I'm really happy to meet some of the clients as well.
Well, thank you. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you being here. And
Welcome.
if anybody has any other questions that have nothing to do with this presentation and you want to have a conversation or you want to bring something up, now would be the time.
Thank you, Danya.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So first, thank you, Danya. I think actually this was a very good introduction to exactly that sort of kind of different type of investments. Just to give a background, Judy and Bill, Tom Robinson referred me to you guys and this sets of meetings because we started to do some investments with him. And so I've been actually looking to buy some businesses and have this part in my portfolio, which I haven't even, kind of dipped the toes into this sort of type of investment. So I think just from the standpoint, the first step to just the basics of how to buy a business is this was a perfect kind of introduction to know where to even start looking. So that was a really good presentation regarding that. just to give you that kind of 2 cents. I'm
I
sure that
appreciate it.
there's very many more things that are technical and dependent on the type of business that being bought, but I thought that this was a very good basic presentation of what to look for in just a very basic deal. So I really appreciate just kind of like to get the idea of what this may mean in the future.
Absolutely. Make sure
I
you
appreciate
capture the stuff in the chat and set an appointment with Danya. You can obviously, if Thompson is, you can come here, you can reach out to us, but you're at the perfect timing because it's like Danya said, you can't repeat it often enough. The best time to get a
Yeah.
attorney is sooner than later.
Yeah.
Right. No, so that's the thing is, yeah. So, and I think I also have to chat with you, Bill and Judy, regarding some other
Not a
let's
problem.
say tax things in the future, that since Tom and I have started to do some business together. But yeah, thank you so much for this presentation.
Any other questions anybody has about anything?
So actually, I had a really quick question, and I think this might help because Bill and Judy, this is part of the reason why Tom sent you my way. I am a physician technically, and it sounds like you guys deal with physicians quite often. And is this part of Danya's kind of presentation is buying and selling practices?
The basics are the same. There may be some differences. For example, when you buy a medical practice or a dental practice, there are even higher regulations. So you got to make sure that those are covered. You also, it's often a personal service business. So for example, if you sell a widget company, nobody really cares who's making the widgets. In a case where you're buying a restaurant, they don't really care as much about the person that owns the restaurant. They care about the chef. If you're buying a medical practice, generally, unless it's very large, there is a following of the provider, and then you have to look at whether that following is going to stay with you. So I would say, because I've participated in a lot of these just from the accountant side, there's probably about 70 to 75% of everything she said is exactly the same. And there's probably 25% of really specifics that relate to healthcare.
Just want to add too that this is where a transitional agreement is really, really important, because what often happens, as I'm sure the accountants know too, is that when a doctor leaves a practice, a lot of the patients will drop off. And so the selling physician, like, as a buyer, you want the selling physician to hang around for probably a year or two. Is pretty common. And so you want to make sure that it's clearly negotiated, and that the doctor is going to stay on board so the patients don't just leave after you buy a practice.
What we've often recommended is something called an earn-out. So you pay for a portion of it now, and then the rest of it is paid over time based on the percentage of profit or percentage of gross that you have. So that over 10 years, or not 10 years, 10 months, 12 months, you're able to adjust off the price so that you can watch how the patient flow stays with you. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to thank everybody again for coming. Thank you, Danya, for presenting. I hope that you come back again sometime and just watch who else is going to show up. We have this every Wednesday night from 5:30 to 6:30 Central. Sometimes it's informative like it is today. Sometimes it's funny because we have people coming in telling jokes, and sometimes it's confounding because people come with problems that we really have to work hard to solve. So please come every week and see what else is up.